December 1950. MacArthur, the general who promised victory by Christmas, sits in his Tokyo headquarters staring at maps showing American forces in desperate retreat. The confident advance to the Yalu River has become the longest fighting withdrawal in American military history. In Beijing, Mao Zedong receives intelligence reports documenting MacArthur's crisis, and what he says reveals not triumph, but cold strategic calculation. Mao understands that MacArthur's recognition that the war cannot be won creates more dangerous situation than MacArthur's earlier confidence. A desperate enemy seeking to salvage victory through escalation is more threatening than an overconfident enemy making predictable mistakes. What Mao says in this moment shapes how China will manage the war it has just entered, defining strategy that will outlast MacArthur's command and will determine whether Chinese intervention achieves its objectives or triggers catastrophe. China cannot control. Subscribe for more MacArthur stories and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Mao Zedong receives detailed intelligence about MacArthur's changing assessment of the Korean War through multiple sources. Chinese intelligence officers monitoring American military communications report dramatic shift in tone and content of messages between MacArthur's headquarters and Washington. Soviet intelligence, which Stalin shares with Mao, provides information about panic in American command structure as the scale of Chinese intervention becomes undeniable. Most telling are the public statements MacArthur begins making, abandoning his confident predictions of easy victory and instead describing the war as unwinnable under current political restrictions. What Mao learns from these sources is that MacArthur has moved from certainty about victory to recognition of strategic failure in a matter of weeks. What Mao says to his Politburo about MacArthur's desperation reveals sophisticated understanding of American military culture and of MacArthur's psychology. Mao notes that MacArthur is not accepting defeat quietly or recommending withdrawal from Korea. Instead, MacArthur is advocating for dramatic escalation, including bombing Chinese territory, using nuclear weapons, and expanding the war in ways that would risk World War III. Mao interprets this not as rational military assessment, but as desperate attempt by commander who cannot accept that his strategy has failed to salvage victory through reckless means. The danger is not that MacArthur will continue making the mistakes that allowed Chinese tactical success. The danger is that MacArthur will convince Washington to authorize escalations that could create catastrophe far worse than current stalemate. The intelligence Mao receives about tensions between MacArthur and Washington is particularly significant. Reports indicate that Truman and his advisors are resisting MacArthur's recommendations for escalation and are increasingly concerned about MacArthur's judgment. But Mao cannot be certain that this resistance will hold if Chinese forces continue to inflict defeats on American troops. American public opinion, shocked by the reversal from promised victory to desperate retreat, might pressure Washington to authorize the escalations MacArthur wants. Mao must calculate strategy based on possibility that MacArthur's desperation might yet convince Washington to expand the war in ways that would put Chinese security at risk, far beyond what the intervention in Korea was meant to address. What makes MacArthur's desperation dangerous from Mao's perspective is that it creates unpredictability. When MacArthur was confident, his actions were predictable. He would advance aggressively, dismiss warnings, overextend his forces. Chinese strategy could exploit this predictability, but desperate MacArthur advocating for nuclear weapons and attacks on Chinese territory is an unpredictable threat that Chinese military planning has not fully prepared for. Mao must develop strategy that achieves Chinese objectives while managing risk that MacArthur's desperation might trigger escalations that transform limited war into general conflict. China cannot win. Mao's assessment of the strategic situation after MacArthur realizes the war is lost is that China has achieved its core objective of preventing American conquest of North Korea, but that consolidating this success without triggering dangerous American escalation requires careful management. Chinese forces have demonstrated capability to fight American military to stalemate, which serves Chinese interests by establishing that Chinese security concerns must be respected. But pushing too far or inflicting defeat so humiliating that American leadership feels compelled to escalate risks turning strategic success into strategic catastrophe. What Mao says to his military commanders is that Chinese strategy must shift from exploiting MacArthur's overconfidence to managing MacArthur's desperation, which requires different approach emphasizing limited objectives and avoiding provocations that might justify the escalations MacArthur is advocating. Mao's understanding of American military culture, shaped by his decades fighting enemies who were materially superior, allows him to recognize patterns in how Americans respond to setbacks. When Americans believe they are winning, they can be careless and overconfident, making them vulnerable to tactical surprise. But when Americans recognize they are losing, they often respond with escalation rather than acceptance of defeat, throwing more resources and more extreme measures at problems they cannot solve through conventional means. MacArthur's advocacy for nuclear weapons and attacks on Chinese territory represents exactly this pattern of escalation in response to setbacks, and Mao must ensure that Chinese strategy does not trigger American desperation that leads to catastrophic escalation. What Mao says about nuclear weapons reveals his awareness that this is the greatest threat Chinese intervention faces. China has no nuclear weapons. If America decides to use nuclear weapons against Chinese forces in Korea or against Chinese territory, China cannot retaliate in kind and would suffer catastrophic losses. Mao's calculation when approving intervention was that American political leadership would not authorize nuclear weapons for limited war in Korea. But MacArthur's desperation and his public advocacy for nuclear use creates risk that this calculation might prove wrong. Mao must consider what Chinese strategy should be if America does use nuclear weapons, and his conclusion is grim. China would have to accept the losses and continue fighting, demonstrating that even nuclear weapons cannot force Chinese surrender when Chinese security interests are at stake. If you're discovering how Mao's strategy evolved to counter MacArthur's desperation, subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. The intelligence Mao receives about American domestic politics suggests that MacArthur's recommendations for escalation face significant opposition in Washington. Truman and his advisors are concerned about Allied reactions to expanded war, about Soviet response to attacks on Chinese territory, and about the precedent of using nuclear weapons in limited war. But Mao cannot rely on this opposition remaining firm if Chinese forces inflict additional humiliating defeats on American troops. American public opinion, which supported the war when MacArthur promised easy victory, might demand dramatic action if the alternative appears to be accepting defeat. Mao must calibrate Chinese military operations to achieve Chinese objectives without creating situations that would give escalation advocates in America arguments that might overcome current resistance. What Mao tells Peng Dehuai and other military commanders is that Chinese strategy must now emphasize creating military stalemate rather than seeking decisive victory. The initial Chinese offensive succeeded in pushing American forces away from Chinese border and demonstrating Chinese capability. Further offensive operations risk diminishing returns as American forces establish better defensive positions and as Chinese supply lines become overextended. More importantly, pursuing American forces too aggressively risks creating impression that China seeks to conquer South Korea, which would give MacArthur political ammunition to argue for expanded war. Limited objectives pursued with restraint serve Chinese strategic interests better than ambitious campaigns that might trigger the American escalation Mao wants to avoid. The tension between military success and strategic restraint creates difficult decisions for Mao. Chinese forces have momentum after their successful surprise attack. Peng and other commanders want to pursue retreating American forces and potentially drive them off the Korean peninsula entirely. But Mao must balance military opportunities against strategic risks. What he says about this balance reveals his understanding that in revolutionary warfare, knowing when to stop is as important as knowing when to attack. Chinese intervention has achieved its essential objective. Pursuing total victory, when limited success serves Chinese interests, risks turning strategic achievement into strategic disaster if it triggers escalations that Chinese strategy was designed to avoid. The strategic problem Mao faces after MacArthur realizes the war is lost is unique in military history. China has achieved tactical success beyond what most observers thought possible. Chinese forces have demonstrated capability to fight American military to stalemate despite enormous disadvantages in equipment and technology. But this very success creates risk of triggering American escalation that would threaten Chinese security far more than MacArthur's original advance to the Yalu River did. Mao must find a way to consolidate Chinese gains while giving America a path to accept stalemate without feeling compelled to escalate in response to humiliation. What Mao says about creating conditions for eventual armistice reveals sophisticated understanding of how wars end when neither side can achieve decisive victory. Military stalemate alone does not produce peace. There must be political process that allows both sides to claim they have achieved sufficient objectives to justify ending the fighting. For China, the objective was preventing American forces from occupying all of Korea, which has been achieved. For America, the objective becomes preserving South Korea, which remains possible despite MacArthur's failures. Mao's strategy is to create military conditions where this mutual acceptance of limited objectives becomes politically feasible for American leadership. The challenge is managing the period between MacArthur's recognition that total victory is impossible and the eventual political decision by American leadership to accept limited objectives and negotiate armistice. During this period, MacArthur and others who share his total victory philosophy will continue advocating for escalation. Chinese forces must maintain military pressure sufficient to prevent American forces from regaining initiative, but must avoid defeats so devastating that American public opinion demands the escalations MacArthur wants. This requires calibration of military operations based on political calculations about American domestic reaction, which is extraordinarily difficult even for a leader as politically sophisticated as Mao. What Mao tells his commanders about acceptable casualties and acceptable objectives reflects this strategic calculation. Chinese forces should inflict steady attrition on American and United Nations forces, making continuation of the war costly enough that negotiated settlement becomes attractive alternative to indefinite stalemate. But Chinese forces should not attempt dramatic breakthroughs or campaigns aimed at destroying major American units, because such operations would be costly for Chinese forces and would risk creating crisis that might justify American escalation. The goal is to make the war unwinnable for America without making it so intolerable that America feels compelled to expand it beyond Korea. The role of Stalin and the Soviet Union in Chinese strategic calculations adds another layer of complexity. Stalin has been encouraging Chinese intervention and has promised support, but Mao recognizes that Stalin's interests are not identical to Chinese interests. Stalin benefits from American forces being tied down in Korea, but does not want to risk direct Soviet involvement in the war. Mao must manage Soviet expectations while maintaining Chinese independence in strategic decisions. What Mao says about Stalin's role reveals his awareness that China is fighting this war for Chinese security interests, not as proxy for Soviet strategic objectives, and that Chinese strategy must serve Chinese goals even when those goals differ from what Stalin might prefer. Mao's experience with revolutionary warfare spanning decades has taught him that wars against materially superior enemies rarely end quickly with decisive victories. Instead, they become protracted conflicts where political will and ability to sustain casualties matter more than technological advantages or tactical brilliance. When MacArthur realizes the war is lost, Mao understands that the war is not actually ending, but is entering a new phase that could last years. Chinese strategy must be sustainable over a long period, which requires different approach than the initial offensive that exploited MacArthur's mistakes. What Mao says about protracted warfare reveals his understanding that Chinese advantages over American forces lie not in superior equipment or tactics, but in superior ability to endure hardship and accept costs over extended time. American military is powerful, but American society has limited tolerance for casualties in wars that do not directly threaten American security. Chinese forces are materially weaker, but Chinese society, freshly emerged from decades of war and revolution, has already demonstrated capacity to endure suffering that would break other nations. This asymmetry and tolerance for costs becomes strategic advantage in protracted conflict, where neither side can achieve quick victory. The casualties Chinese forces are suffering concern Mao, but do not cause him to question the intervention. He receives reports of horrific losses from cold, from American firepower, from logistical failures. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers have already died or been wounded. But Mao's calculus is that these costs serve essential Chinese security interests and that accepting them now prevents worse consequences later. What he says to justify these casualties reveals revolutionary leaders' willingness to sacrifice on massive scale when he believes cause is just and necessary. This willingness is alien to democratic societies where leaders must justify casualties to skeptical publics, and it creates fundamental asymmetry in how China and America can prosecute the war. The question of when the war will end and what conditions China should accept for armistice is already being discussed in Beijing, even as fighting continues. Mao's position is that China should be prepared to fight for years if necessary, but should be open to negotiated settlement once Chinese security objectives are clearly achieved. The minimum Chinese requirement is that American forces not occupy all of Korea and not be positioned directly on Chinese border. Any settlement that achieves this objective is acceptable even if it leaves other issues unresolved. What Mao says about armistice terms reveals his focus on essential security interests rather than on ideological victory or on total defeat of American forces. The domestic political situation in China requires Mao to justify the costs of intervention to Chinese people and to Communist Party leadership. The intervention is popular among Chinese nationalists who see it as demonstration that China will defend its interests against any threat. But the casualties and economic costs are substantial, and Mao must ensure that domestic support for the war remains strong, even as it becomes clear that quick victory is not possible. What Mao says in domestic propaganda emphasizes that Chinese forces are defending Chinese security against American imperialism, and that the sacrifices being made serve essential national interests. This framing is easier to sustain in an authoritarian system than similar justifications would be in democracy, where opposition voices can question whether limited war serves national interests worth the costs being paid. What Mao said after MacArthur realized the war was lost proved prophetic about how the Korean War would end and what strategic lessons it would teach. Mao's assessment that Chinese intervention could achieve Chinese security objectives without triggering catastrophic American escalation was validated by the eventual armistice in 1953. The war ended with Korea divided near where it had been when Chinese forces intervened, which achieved Chinese goal of preventing American conquest of North Korea. American forces were pushed away from Chinese border, eliminating the immediate security threat that Chinese intervention was designed to address. These outcomes vindicated Mao's strategic judgment that intervention was necessary and feasible despite the risks. The broader strategic impact of Chinese intervention extended far beyond Korea. China established itself as military power capable of fighting United States to stalemate, despite enormous disadvantages in technology and resources. This demonstration of Chinese capability forced Western powers to take Chinese security interests seriously and to recognize that China could not be pressured or threatened without risk of military response. The psychological impact throughout Asia was profound, as formerly colonized nations saw that Western military superiority could be challenged successfully by determined Asian forces willing to accept costs that Western nations would not accept. MacArthur's removal from command in April 1951, just months after he realized the war was lost, vindicated Mao's assessment that MacArthur's recommendations for escalation would not be accepted by American political leadership. Truman's decision to fire MacArthur rather than authorize expanded war demonstrated that American democracy, despite its military power, had political constraints that limited how wars could be fought. This recognition became central to Mao's understanding of how to compete with American power throughout the Cold War. Democratic societies have military advantages, but also political vulnerabilities that can be exploited through strategies that impose costs democracies find difficult to sustain politically. The casualties China suffered during the Korean War were enormous, with hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers killed and many more wounded. But Mao's judgment was that these costs purchased Chinese security and international respect that could not be obtained through diplomacy alone. What he says in later years about the Korean intervention reflects his belief that China's willingness to defend its interests militarily despite the costs established China as power that would be taken seriously by any potential adversary. The intervention became foundational myth of modern China, proof that revolutionary China could defend itself against any threat regardless of the enemy's material advantages. The final assessment of what Mao said after MacArthur realized the war was lost is that Mao correctly understood that MacArthur's desperation created different kind of challenge than MacArthur's earlier confidence, but that careful Chinese strategy could manage this challenge while achieving Chinese objectives. MacArthur's recognition that he could not win the war made him dangerous advocate for escalation, but it also made his position politically vulnerable in Washington. Mao's strategy of creating military stalemate while avoiding provocations that would justify escalation allowed Chinese intervention to achieve its goals, while limiting the risks of catastrophic expansion of the war. The Korean War ended not with decisive victory by either side, but with armistice that served Chinese core interests while allowing America to preserve South Korea. This outcome, which seemed impossible when MacArthur was confidently advancing toward the Yalu River, demonstrated that careful strategy and willingness to accept costs can allow materially weaker power to achieve its objectives against stronger adversary when that adversary makes critical errors and when strategic objectives are limited and clearly defined. Subscribe to discover more about how Mao's strategies shaped the outcome MacArthur never anticipated.